And the new self that we are to put on is created by God and given to us by God to wear. We don't make it ourselves. We don't buy it. It's given to us. It's created for us and given to us. And as we undress and submit to the dressing of Christ, then we look like him, after his likeness, in true holiness and righteousness. I think I mentioned this in a sermon a few years ago, but I'll mention it again because that was a few years ago and maybe you've forgotten or you weren't there. It comes from one of my favorite books by C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And C.S. Lewis here gives us a picture of what Paul is talking about in Ephesians chapter 4. There's a part in the middle of the story about the little boy named Eustace. And if you've read the book, you know about Eustace. He's a rotten little boy and is very selfish and doesn't get along with anybody else who's there. And at one point, they're on an island, and he discovers this cave filled with treasure, and he's thinking, all right, I can get all this treasure for myself. However, if you know anything about how things work in this world, caves with treasure in them also have dragons, and he turns into a dragon because of his greed and his own selfishness. And initially, he likes being a dragon. He thinks, this is great. I can terrify all of those people that have been annoying me. And he really likes this ability to fly and terrify people. But eventually, Lewis says that a desperate loneliness sets in. And there's a phrase that he uses. And just think about this phrase. It may capture your own experience. He says this. Lewis writes this about Eustace as a dragon. He was afraid to be alone, and yet he was ashamed to be with the others. That's quite an insight. Afraid to be alone, but ashamed to be with the others. And there's a whole chapter devoted to what happened to Eustace and his salvation. And we read that one night, Aslan, who's a lion, appears to him and leads him up a mountain. And they walk up that mountain, and at the top of the mountain, there's a garden. And in the middle of the garden, there's a spring. And Aslan says to Eustace the dragon, undress and bathe. And at first, Eustace doesn't know what he's talking about. How can I undress? I'm a dragon. But then he remembers that dragons are reptiles. He says they're kind of a snaky sort of a thing, and snakes can shed their skin. So he thinks, oh, maybe I can shed my skin. So he starts to scratch and claw at himself, and he sheds his skin. But when he goes to the fountain to bathe, he sees in his own reflection he's still a dragon. So he tries it again, and then he tries it a third time. And finally, Aslan the lion says to him, let me undress you. And this is what Paul is saying here. Let Christ undress you. Surrender to him. And listen to how Lewis describes what happens. This is actually Eustace's own telling of it. The very first tear the lion made, was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. He peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done it myself the other 3 times, only they didn't hurt those times. And there it was, lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath now that I had no skin. And he threw me into the water. It smarted like anything for a moment. After that, it became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that the pain was gone. Then I saw why. I had turned into a boy again. After a bit, the lion took me out and dressed me.